The frozen air of December 1944 bit through every gap in the steel hull. Inside a Sherman tank parked near a Belgian crossroads, a loader stared at 6 strange rounds tucked into the ammunition rack. They looked different, sleeker, a matte aluminum body encasing something precious enough to change the course of the war. The crew had been explicitly forbidden from using them except in the most desperate circumstances. But as the rumble of approaching armor shook the snow from the pine trees, and the unmistakable silhouette of a Tiger tank emerged from the morning fog, desperation had arrived. The gunner's hands trembled, not from cold, but from years of conditioning that told him his 76mm gun was useless against that monster. Then his commander gave an order that defied everything they had been taught. Load the tungsten round. What happened next would shatter a myth that had dominated armored warfare for 2 years. Before we continue this story, if you enjoy deep dives into military history, take a moment to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you are watching from today. The Tiger tank had haunted Allied tankers since its first appearance in North Africa in 1942. German engineers had created something that seemed to violate the rules of armored warfare. 100 millimeters of frontal armor, sloped and hardened to deflect incoming rounds. The infamous 88mm gun, originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, capable of destroying any Allied tank from distances exceeding 2,000 meters. When intelligence reports first reached American training camps, instructors struggled to explain how their crews were supposed to fight such a machine. The official answer was uncomfortable. Do not engage frontally, attempt to flank. Call for air support, retreat if necessary. Wait for the tank destroyers. This doctrine assumed tank destroyers would always be available. It assumed air support could reach the battlefield in time. It assumed 5 Shermans could coordinate a flanking maneuver while the Tiger picked them off one by one. The reality was carnage. American tank crews learned to identify Tigers by sound alone. The distinctive rumble of that Maybach engine became a death knell. Crews reported hearing a Tiger before seeing it. They would halt their advance. Their hearts would race. Some would abandon their tanks rather than face what was coming. This psychological terror had a name among military historians: Tiger fear. And it was absolutely justified. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. A Tiger could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor from nearly 2,000 yards. A Sherman equipped with the standard 75mm gun could not penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at any realistic combat distance. Even the improved 76mm gun, which began appearing in mid-1944, struggled to punch through the Tiger's glossus plate at ranges beyond 600 meters. The engagement envelope overwhelmingly favored the German tank. A Tiger commander could sit comfortably at 1,500 meters, systematically destroying Shermans one after another, watching round after round bounce harmlessly off his frontal armor. When American shells did strike, crews inside Tigers reported hearing nothing more than a metallic thud. The psychological advantage compounded itself. Inside a Sherman, crews knew they were essentially driving Coffins. The tanks earned grim nicknames. Ronson's after the cigarette lighter company, whose slogan claimed their product lit the first time, every time. Tommy Cooker's the British version of the same macabre humor. When a German round penetrated a Sherman, the ammunition often detonated. The thin armor provided little protection. Fires spread rapidly through the cramped interior. Crews had seconds to escape before the ammunition rack exploded. Many did not escape. The 3rd Armored Division entered combat in Normandy with 232 Shermans. By the end of the European campaign, 648 Shermans had been completely destroyed, with another 700 knocked out, repaired, and returned to service, a loss rate of 580%. Behind every destroyed tank was a crew of 5 young men who had trusted their machine to protect them. But there was a secret. Deep within the American war industry, metallurgists had been working on something extraordinary. In 1943, engineers at the Watertown Arsenal in Massachusetts created a shell that could change everything. The principle was elegant in its physics. Armor penetration depends on two factors: the hardness of the projectile and the kinetic energy it delivers upon impact. Kinetic energy increases with the square of velocity, double the speed, quadruple the energy. The problem was that heavier shells moved slower. Steel armor-piercing rounds were effective, but limited by their mass. Tungsten carbide offered a solution. This compound ranked 9.0 on the Mohs hardness scale, harder than any armor steel Germany could produce. A small tungsten core properly designed could concentrate enormous kinetic energy into a tiny impact point. But tungsten was dense, incredibly dense. A full-caliber tungsten projectile would be too heavy to achieve the necessary velocity. The engineers solved this problem with the sabot concept. They encased a narrow tungsten carbide penetrator inside a lightweight aluminum body. When the round left the barrel, the aluminum sabot stripped away, allowing the dense tungsten core to fly toward its target at unprecedented speed. The result was designated T4, later standardized as the M93 high-velocity armor-piercing round. It weighed 18.91 pounds, measured 32.6 inches in length, and left the 76-millimeter gun barrel at 3,400 feet per second. Standard armor-piercing rounds achieved only 2,600 feet per second. This 31% increase in velocity, when squared in the kinetic energy equation, meant the lighter tungsten penetrator hit with nearly double the armor-defeating power of the heavier steel round. In testing, the M93 could punch through 160 millimeters of armor at 30 degrees obliquity at a range of 1,000 yards. The Tiger's frontal armor was 100 millimeters. Suddenly, the mathematics had reversed. When the tungsten core struck Tiger armor at 3,400 feet per second, it did not deform or shatter like steel projectiles. It punched through like a drill bit, concentrating all its kinetic energy on a tiny impact point. The core would bore through the armor plate, creating a jet of molten metal that sprayed into the crew compartment. If the penetration occurred near the ammunition storage, the results were catastrophic. German tankers who survived such strikes described the interior of their vehicles transforming into infernos within seconds. The psychological advantage had shifted, but there was a devastating catch. Tungsten was one of the most strategically critical materials of the entire war. America imported most of its tungsten from China, where wartime disruption severely limited supply. The entire Allied war effort depended on this single metal. Incendiary bombs used in the strategic bombing campaign required tungsten components. Navy battleships firing at Japanese cruisers needed tungsten armor-piercing shells for their 16-inch guns. Most critically, industrial machine tools used tungsten carbide cutting edges to manufacture everything from conventional shells to aircraft engines. A single tungsten carbide lathe bit could machine parts for 10,000 conventional projectiles. The strategic calculation was harsh and seemingly irrefutable. Each M93 round contained approximately 0.8 kilograms of tungsten carbide. A single Sherman carrying 6 rounds required nearly 5 kilograms of this scarce material. That same tungsten could instead produce machine tooling capable of manufacturing 100 standard armor-piercing rounds. From a purely mathematical standpoint, tungsten should go to machine tools, not individual tank rounds. The War Department agreed. Tank units received strict conservation orders, 3 to 5 rounds per Sherman, if they received any at all. The orders were explicit. Use only on critical targets. Tank destroyer battalions received priority. Their 76-millimeter guns used the same ammunition, and their doctrine focused specifically on killing enemy armor. Regular Sherman units received scraps. This created an agonizing situation for the men actually fighting the war. Crews loaded the precious tungsten rounds, carried them through France and Belgium, watched tigers destroy their friends, and could not fire the rounds that might save them. They would engage panthers and tigers with standard ammunition, watch their shells bounce away, then die knowing they possessed the weapon that could have penetrated that armor. The forbidden ammunition sat in their racks like a cruel reminder of bureaucratic priorities that seemed impossibly distant from the reality of combat. Commanders faced impossible choices: disobey orders and risk court-martial, obey orders and watch their men die. For months the frustration simmered across the front lines. The tungsten shortage was not merely an American problem. It was a global strategic crisis. Most of the wolframite mines in Europe were located in northwestern Spain and northern Portugal. Tungsten exports accounted for nearly 1% of Spanish gross domestic product and 20% of its exports by 1943 and 44. The Allies pressured Francisco Franco's regime intensely to halt sales to Germany. This diplomatic battle, known as the Wolfram Crisis, eventually forced Spain to reduce tungsten shipments to Germany to just 40 tons per month. The struggle over this single metal demonstrated its importance to both sides. Germany had recognized tungsten's potential even before the Americans. German engineers were the first to use tungsten carbide cores in high-velocity armor-piercing projectiles. When these rounds struck British tanks in North Africa, the results were devastating. British armor, designed to resist standard steel projectiles, virtually melted under the impact of tungsten penetrators. The Germans designated their version Panzergranate 40, and it gave their tanks a significant advantage in the early desert campaigns. But Germany faced even more severe tungsten shortages than the Allies. By 1943, Panzergranate 40 rounds were increasingly rare on the battlefield. The British response to the Tiger threat came from a different direction. Rather than relying solely on tungsten, they developed the 17-pounder anti-tank gun, a massive weapon that achieved its penetrating power through barrel length and propellant charge. The longer barrel gave the projectile more time to accelerate, achieving significantly higher muzzle velocities than shorter guns. The 17-pounder could punch through a Tiger's frontal armor at distances up to 2,000 meters using standard ammunition. When British engineers developed an armor-piercing, discarding sabot round for this gun, its penetration exceeded 200 millimeters at 1,000 meters. The British mounted this 17-pounder in a modified Sherman chassis, creating the Sherman Firefly. This gave British tank units the ability to engage German heavy armor on equal terms. The Firefly became one of the most effective Allied tanks of the war, though its numbers were limited. German tankers learned to identify Fireflies by their longer gun barrels and prioritize them as targets. Firefly crews knew they carried a target on their backs. Their tank could kill Tigers, which made them the first vehicle Germans would attempt to destroy in any engagement. American tank crews watched their British allies with a mixture of admiration and frustration. The United States had chosen a different path, prioritizing production numbers and mechanical reliability over individual tank capability. This made strategic sense at the macro level. America produced approximately 49,324 Shermans during the war, compared to just 6,132 Panthers produced by Germany. The ability to replace losses rapidly, to keep units at full strength, to maintain logistical simplicity across vast supply lines, these factors would ultimately prove decisive. But they provided cold comfort to the crew of an individual Sherman facing a Tiger with nothing but standard ammunition. The tungsten rounds existed. They worked. They could turn the Sherman from prey into predator. But policy kept them locked away, rationed like precious medicine, distributed based on calculations that seemed detached from battlefield reality. A tanker watching his friends burn inside their Shermans could be forgiven for questioning whether the mathematicians in Washington understood what their formulas actually meant. Each forbidden round represented a life that might have been saved. Each tungsten allocation that went to machine tools instead of tank ammunition translated to crews fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. Now is a good moment to pause and ask you to hit the like button if you are finding this story compelling. The Battle of the Bulge is about to begin, and the decisions made in the coming days will change armored warfare forever. December 16, 1944. The German offensive crashed through the Ardennes forest with a force that caught Allied commanders completely off guard. Hitler had assembled his last strategic reserve, 25 divisions, including powerful panzer units equipped with Tigers, Panthers, and the massive King Tigers. The objective was Antwerp, the critical port through which Allied supplies flowed. Capture Antwerp, split the Allied forces, sue for a negotiated peace. It was a desperate gamble born of desperation, but in those first chaotic hours, it appeared to be working. The weather cooperated perfectly with the German plan. Dense fog and low clouds grounded Allied aircraft, neutralizing the air superiority that had dominated the battlefield since Normandy. American units, many of them inexperienced, found themselves facing veteran German formations in terrain that favored the defender. The narrow roads through the forest created choke points where German armor could dominate. Towns with names like Bastogne, Saint-Vite, and Stavelot became anchors of desperate resistance. The line bulged westward, threatening to snap entirely. In the northern sector of the bulge, SS tank commander Joachim Peiper led Kampfgruppe Peiper, a powerful armored force spearheading the drive toward the Meuse River crossings. His command included Tiger tanks from the 501st Heavy Tank Battalion, King Tigers from the same unit, and a supporting force of Panthers and Panzer by-4s. Peiper's advance created terror and confusion among American units in his path. The massacre of American prisoners at Malmedy added a bitter edge to the already desperate fighting. This was not merely combat. It had become something darker. The American response came from multiple directions. General Dwight Eisenhower recognized immediately that the German offensive represented both crisis and opportunity. The Germans had committed their last reserves. If they could be stopped and destroyed, the war would be shortened significantly. Eisenhower ordered reinforcements rushed to the bulge from both north and south. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded at Bastogne, their commander responding to surrender demands with a single word that would become legendary. From the south, General George Patton's Third Army wheeled 90 degrees and drove north toward the embattled town. Spearheading Patton's advance was the 4th Armored Division, and leading that division was the 37th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. Abrams had built a reputation as one of the most aggressive armor commanders in the European theater. He understood his Sherman's limitations, but had learned to overcome them through speed, aggression, and tactical creativity. Patton trusted Abrams implicitly. When the Third Army commander wanted something done, he called for the 37th. The drive north was brutal, frozen roads, exhausted crews, German resistance stiffening with every mile. The 4th Armored Division had been in continuous combat since the Normandy breakout. They were under strength, tired, and facing some of the best German units remaining in the West. But they drove on, Patton's exhortation ringing in their ears, "Drive like hell." The relief of Bastogne depended on their speed. The fate of thousands of surrounded paratroopers hung in the balance. Abrams gathered his officers before the final push. The intelligence reports were clear. German heavy armor blocked the route to Bastogne. Tigers and Panthers, the machines that had terrorized his crews for months. Standard tactics would not work. They could not afford to flank and maneuver while the men at Bastogne ran out of ammunition and medical supplies. They would have to go through. And that meant using weapons they had been forbidden to employ freely. The exact order Abrams gave has been recorded differently by various sources, but its essence was clear. Use every tungsten round available. No more conservation. No more waiting for critical targets. Every Tiger encountered was a critical target. The bureaucratic restrictions that had constrained his crews for months were suspended by command decision on the ground where it mattered. Some historians suggest Abrams exceeded his authority. Others argue he merely interpreted existing orders aggressively. What is undeniable is that from that moment, the 37th Tank Battalion fought differently. The mechanics of the M93 round made technical demands on the crews. The tungsten penetrator was smaller diameter than the bore, hence the aluminum sabot sleeve that fell away after muzzle exit. This meant accuracy suffered slightly at long range compared to full-caliber armor-piercing rounds. The M93 was most effective at 500 to 1,500 yards, the exact range bracket where Sherman Tiger engagements typically occurred. Beyond 1,500 yards, accuracy degraded. Under 500 yards, standard 76 mm ammunition could penetrate many German tanks. The tungsten round's effective envelope matched combat reality almost perfectly. Crews also learned the tungsten round's limitations through hard experience. The hard tungsten penetrator could shatter if it struck external equipment before reaching main armor. Track assemblies, spare road wheels, log bundles attached to German tanks as improvised additional protection, these could all defeat the round before it reached the critical armor plate. Gunners had to aim carefully, selecting clean impact points on the enemy vehicle's main armor rather than simply shooting at center mass. The precision required was demanding under combat conditions, but crews adapted quickly when the alternative was death. December 18, 1944. Near the Belgian town of Stavelot, a Sherman from the 37th Tank Battalion encountered a Tiger from Kampfgruppe Piper. The engagement that followed demonstrated everything that had changed. Previously, the Sherman commander would have attempted to disengage, find cover, call for air support, or tank destroyers. The Tiger's frontal armor was simply impenetrable to his standard ammunition beyond close range, but this crew had tungsten rounds loaded and permission to use them. The gunner acquired the target at approximately 800 meters, a challenging shot, but within the effective envelope of the M93. The commander ordered fire. The tungsten core left the barrel at 3,400 feet per second, crossed the distance in less than a second, and struck the Tiger's glacis plate. The penetrator did not bounce. It did not deflect. It bored through 100 millimeters of German armor steel and entered the crew compartment. The Tiger erupted in flame as the ammunition detonated. 56 tons of German engineering became a burning coffin in an instant. The radio call went out immediately. HVAP penetrates Tiger frontal armor. Engage at will. Across the northern flank of the bulge, Sherman crews received this information with something approaching disbelief. For 2 years, they had been told the Tiger was invulnerable from the front. They had watched friends die trying to flank, trying to close the distance, trying everything except what actually worked. Now they learned that the ammunition sitting in their racks, the forbidden tungsten rounds they had been ordered to conserve, could kill Tigers with a single shot from nearly a kilometer away. The psychological reversal was total and immediate. German reports from the following days spoke of American shells of unknown type defeating heavy armor. Tank crews who had dominated their sector for months suddenly found themselves vulnerable. The Panthers and Tigers that had seemed invincible were being destroyed by the same Shermans they had previously dismissed as targets. The fear transferred. German tankers who had advanced confidently began to hesitate. Their armor, their chief protection, had been compromised. The relief of Bastogne on December 26th represents one of the most celebrated moments of the Battle of the Bulge. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams led the final push personally, his tank Thunderbolt at the head of the column. The breakthrough that connected with the surrounded paratroopers came after days of grinding combat through German defensive positions. The 37th Tank Battalion lost 5 men killed, 22 wounded, and 5 missing in the final assault. The 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion, fighting alongside them, suffered 30 killed and 180 wounded. Company C was reduced to just 4 operational tanks. The cost was high, but Bastogne was relieved. In the weeks following the relief of Bastogne, the tactical lessons of tungsten ammunition spread rapidly through American armored units. Crews who had received only a handful of tungsten rounds began employing them more aggressively. Tank destroyers, which had always received priority allocation, shared their ammunition with Sherman crews facing heavy armor. The strict conservation policies remained officially in effect, but the reality on the ground had changed fundamentally. Commanders understood that every Tiger destroyed shortened the war. The industrial calculations that had justified rationing tungsten suddenly seemed less compelling when measured against the lives being saved. By Christmas of 1944, the 3rd Armored Division and other units engaged in the Ardennes had destroyed or crippled dozens of Tigers and Panthers, many by direct frontal hits that would have been impossible weeks earlier. The American after-action reports were blunt in their assessment. HVAP ammunition proved decisive in negating German armor superiority. The bureaucratic resistance to widespread distribution began to crumble under the weight of combat evidence. Factory output of tungsten rounds surged as priorities shifted. By spring of 1945, every Sherman carried a full complement of tungsten ammunition. The human dimension of this transformation deserves emphasis. Behind every statistic was a crew of young men who had spent months believing their tank could not protect them against German heavy armor. They had watched friends burn inside their vehicles. They had developed elaborate tactics to avoid direct confrontation with Tigers, tactics that often failed, that required luck as much as skill. The introduction of effective tungsten ammunition gave them something beyond mere capability. It gave them hope. The psychological burden of facing invincible enemies lifted. They could fight back. They could win. That change in mindset rippled through entire divisions. The German response to the sudden effectiveness of American ammunition was confusion, followed by adaptation. German tankers reported that American shells had somehow improved dramatically. Intelligence officers attempted to recover spent rounds or examine penetration holes to understand what had changed. The realization that the Americans possessed tungsten-cored ammunition capable of defeating German armor forced tactical adjustments. Panthers and Tigers could no longer approach enemy positions with confidence. They required infantry support, careful reconnaissance, positions that minimized their exposure to frontal fire. The tactical flexibility that had made German armor so effective began to erode. The King Tiger, Germany's ultimate tank, deserves separate consideration. This massive vehicle weighed nearly 70 tons and featured frontal armor up to 180 millimeters thick. It was designed specifically to be immune to any anti-tank weapon the Allies possessed. In theory, even the M93 tungsten round should have struggled against this armor. In practice, the King Tiger proved less formidable than its specifications suggested. The turret face, the gun mantlet, the lower glacis plate all presented potential weak points. More importantly, the King Tiger's mechanical unreliability meant that many were lost to breakdowns rather than enemy fire. The Allies learned to target these vehicles carefully, aiming for known weak points rather than attempting to penetrate the thickest armor. The final months of the European War saw a complete reversal of the armored warfare dynamics that had prevailed since 1942. American tank units advanced aggressively, confident in their ability to engage German armor on equal terms. The numerical advantage that had always favored the Allies could now be combined with qualitative effectiveness. A Sherman with tungsten ammunition could engage a Panther or Tiger and win. The mathematics had shifted decisively, and with them, the outcome of countless engagements across Western Europe. The crossing of the Rhine and the final drive into Germany demonstrated this new reality. German armored counterattacks, which had previously threatened to halt or reverse Allied advances, were broken apart by American tank fire. The precious Tigers and Panthers, irreplaceable given Germany's collapsing industrial capacity, were destroyed faster than they could be repaired or replaced. By the time Allied forces reached the Elbe River in April 1945, German armored resistance had essentially ceased to exist as a coherent force. Colonel Creighton Abrams survived the war and went on to a distinguished military career. He commanded American forces in Vietnam from 1968 to 1972, implementing the strategy of Vietnamization that gradually transferred combat responsibilities to South Vietnamese forces. When the United States Army introduced its next-generation main battle tank in 1980, they named it the M1 Abrams in his honor. The man who had defied bureaucratic restrictions to save his crews became synonymous with American armored power. Today, the M1 Abrams remains the primary American battle tank, updated and improved across multiple variants, still carrying the name of the lieutenant colonel who understood that saving tungsten was meaningless if it meant losing crews. The legacy of the tungsten shell extends beyond individual battles or commanders. The M93 HVAP round represented a fundamental shift in how militaries thought about armor penetration. The discarding sabot principle, first employed effectively with the M93, became the standard for tank ammunition in the post-war era. Modern tank guns fire ammunition that descends directly from those 1943 designs. The tungsten penetrators carried by contemporary tanks are larger, faster, and more sophisticated than the M93, but the underlying physics remain identical. Concentrate kinetic energy into the smallest possible impact point using the hardest possible material at the highest possible velocity. The human cost of the delay in deploying tungsten ammunition effectively cannot be calculated precisely, but it was substantial. For months, American tank crews fought and died in vehicles that could have been made significantly more effective with ammunition that already existed. The decisions that constrained tungsten distribution made sense from a certain bureaucratic perspective. Strategic materials must be allocated strategically, but those decisions translated into burning tanks and dead crews. The gap between policy rationality and battlefield reality claimed lives that might otherwise have been saved. This tension between strategic planning and tactical necessity appears repeatedly throughout military history. The officials who restricted tungsten ammunition were not callous or indifferent to the suffering of tank crews. They were attempting to optimize the allocation of scarce resources across a global war effort. But optimization models do not capture the terror of facing an invincible enemy. They do not account for the psychological burden of carrying a weapon you are forbidden to use. The Ardennes campaign demonstrated that sometimes tactical necessity must override strategic planning. Colonel Abrams and commanders like him made that judgment call under fire, and history has validated their decisions. The Tiger tank itself became a symbol of German engineering prowess and ultimate futility. Germany produced only 1,347 Tiger-the-Merce tanks during the entire war. Each one was a masterpiece of metallurgy and mechanical engineering, capable of dominating any battlefield it entered. But Germany could not produce enough Tigers to matter strategically. The resources consumed by each Tiger could have produced multiple Panthers or Panzer I-4s. The maintenance demand stretched already strained logistics networks. The fuel consumption of 56-ton vehicles exhausted Germany's diminishing petroleum reserves. The Tiger was a tactical triumph and a strategic error. a monument to the limitations of quality when faced with overwhelming quantity. The Sherman, by contrast, represented a different philosophy: good enough in sufficient numbers, reliable enough to stay in the fight, simple enough to be maintained by crews with limited training and resources. When the M93 tungsten round made the Sherman capable of engaging German heavy armor effectively, the equation tilted decisively. A machine that was already available in overwhelming numbers suddenly became dangerous to every German tank on the battlefield. The combination of American industrial capacity and improved ammunition proved irresistible. The battle between quality and quantity, between advanced technology and mass production, continues to influence military procurement debates today. Nations must choose how to allocate limited defense budgets between smaller numbers of superior systems and larger numbers of adequate ones. The Second World War provided evidence for both approaches, but the ultimate lesson may be more nuanced. Quality matters, but so does the ability to get effective weapons to the crews who need them. The best tank in the world is worthless if it cannot reach the battlefield or if it sits immobilized in a repair depot. The tungsten round that turned Tigers into burning coffins was not a miracle weapon. It was the product of systematic engineering, industrial capacity, and eventually command decisions that prioritized combat effectiveness over bureaucratic compliance. The men who fired those rounds were not superhuman. They were young Americans, most of them barely out of their teens, who had been asked to fight in machines that seemed designed to get them killed. When they finally received ammunition capable of fighting back effectively, they used it with devastating proficiency. The frozen forests of the Ardennes witnessed the final major German offensive of the war. The relief of Bastogne, spearheaded by Abrams and his 37th Tank Battalion, became one of the defining American victories of the European campaign. But equally important was what the battle demonstrated about the changing nature of armored warfare. The myth of German tank invincibility, carefully cultivated since the first Tigers appeared in Tunisia, shattered against tungsten cores traveling at 3,400 feet per second. The fear that had paralyzed Allied tank crews for years dissolved in the smoke of burning Panthers. War is ultimately a human endeavor. The specifications of tanks and shells matter, but they matter because they affect the human beings who must fight inside those machines. The tungsten round gave American tankers a chance to survive encounters that had previously been death sentences. That chance translated into lives saved, families unbroken, futures preserved. The strategic calculations about tungsten allocation were not wrong in their logic, but they underestimated the importance of hope. Men who believe they can win fight differently than men who believe they are doomed. The M93 HVA round provided more than armor penetration. It provided the possibility of victory. As you reach the end of this story, take a moment to consider subscribing if you have not already. The history of the Second World War contains countless stories of technological innovation, human courage, and decisions that shaped the modern world. The tungsten shell that turned Tigers into burning coffins represents just one chapter in this vast narrative. Each development in weapons technology created new possibilities and new horrors, changed the calculations of commanders, and affected the fates of individual soldiers. Understanding these developments helps us understand both the war itself and the world that emerged from its ashes. The M93 round that transformed armored warfare in the winter of 1944 originated in the laboratories of metallurgists who never saw combat. It traveled through a supply chain that stretched across the Pacific Ocean, through factories working around the clock, past bureaucrats arguing about allocation priorities. It reached the hands of young men who had never heard of tungsten carbide, but who understood immediately what this new ammunition meant for their survival. The connection between those distant laboratories and those frozen battlefields reminds us that wars are won not just by soldiers, but by entire societies mobilized for conflict. The Sherman tank continued to serve long after the Second World War ended. Modified versions fought in Korea and remained in service with numerous armies into the 1970s and beyond. The Israeli Defense Forces employed upgraded Shermans with success as late as the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The basic design proved adaptable enough to accept larger guns, improved engines, and better armor over decades of continued use. The tank that American tankers had cursed as a death trap became a symbol of reliable, affordable armored fighting power. The Tiger, by contrast, vanished from service almost immediately after Germany's surrender. The complexity that had made it formidable also made it unsustainable without Germany's industrial infrastructure. Only a handful of Tigers survived the war intact, most of them preserved in museums as monuments to a particular moment in armored vehicle design. Visitors to these museums often marvel at the Tiger's size and apparent invincibility. Few realize that the massive armor they admire was penetrated repeatedly by shells weighing less than 20 pounds, fired from tanks that looked almost fragile by comparison. The story of the secret shell that turned Tigers into burning coffins is ultimately a story about the relationship between technology and human decision-making. The technology existed before it was used effectively. The M93 round could have made a difference months earlier if different choices had been made about its distribution. The delay cost lives that might have been saved. But when the decision finally came to use this weapon without restriction, the results were decisive. Technology creates possibilities. Human beings determine whether those possibilities are realized. The frozen ground of the Ardents has been peaceful for nearly 80 years now. The forests have regrown. The towns have rebuilt. The crossroads where Shermans and Tigers once dueled are now tourist attractions, marked by monuments and museums. But the lessons of those battles remain relevant. The importance of providing soldiers with effective weapons. The danger of allowing bureaucratic calculations to override tactical necessity. The fundamental humanity of armed conflict in which victory and defeat are measured not in abstract statistics, but in the lives of individual men and women. The tungsten cores that punched through Tiger armor have long since corroded away. The aluminum sabots that fell from those speeding projectiles have dissolved into the Belgian soil. But the impact of those shells continues to echo through military history. Every modern tank gun fires ammunition descended from those wartime designs. Every military procurement debate weighs quality against quantity, strategic allocation against tactical necessity. The fundamental questions posed by the tungsten shortage of 1944 remain unanswered, renewed with every generation of weapons technology. The young men who loaded those M93 rounds, who heard the distinctive sound of the discarding sabot separating from the tungsten penetrator, who watched Tigers explode into flame for the first time in their experience, those men are nearly all gone now. Their testimony exists in memoirs, oral histories, and after-action reports. Their photographs show faces marked by exhaustion and determination, young men old before their time, carrying burdens their grandchildren can barely imagine. They fought with the tools they were given, survived when they could, and died when they could not. The tungsten shell that transformed their chances of survival was, for them, not a technical achievement or a strategic asset. It was simply the difference between living and dying. The snow has fallen many times over the Ardennes since December of 1944. Each winter covers the old battlefields in white, erasing the traces of conflict until spring reveals them again. The Tiger tanks that once terrified Allied crews have rusted into history, their threat existing only in books and documentaries. The Shermans that seemed so vulnerable have become icons of American industrial might, their numbers overwhelming the quality advantage that German engineers had labored to create. And somewhere in that transformation In the moment when a tungsten core first penetrated a Tiger's frontal armor, the balance of the war shifted permanently. The secret shell that turned Tigers into burning coffins was never truly secret. Its existence was known. Its capabilities were documented. What made it secret was the restriction on its use, the bureaucratic decisions that kept it from the crews who needed it most. When that secrecy ended, when commanders like Abrams ordered their crews to fire freely, the war entered its final phase. The myth of German armor invincibility died in the snow outside Stavelot, killed by a 19-pound projectile containing less than a kilogram of tungsten carbide. The crews who fired those shells did not know they were making history. They knew only that, finally, they could fight back.